Thank you so much for coming out on this very beautiful day. I look forward to the conversation we're going to have. I'm Yore-VanOosterhout. I work with a lot of data at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University, which is where you all are here for the moment in this building. The Johnson Center is an externally oriented applied research center at the university. We work with foundations and nonprofits, scholars and students and partners in business and government. And this is the key to bridge the gap between the information communities need and the change they want to make. So a colleague of mine was pointing this out earlier, right? We really put this data and this information into practice, right, in the field. That's kind of where we consider our specialty, right? We've been doing this for quite a while. The Johnson Center was established in 1992 with support from the Kellogg Foundation. Our core work includes developing and disseminating data-informed, evidence-backed resources that deepen the reach and influence of research and lived experience in philanthropy, and address compelling challenges and needs in the field. We also serve individual organizations and the field of philanthropy as a whole, as a trusted advisor, a sector expert providing contract and grant-supported evaluation of products and services, case studies, landscape scans, and more. And if you haven't yet seen it, I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug for a couple of things. Please check out our 11 Trends in Philanthropy report. It's an annual snapshot of the sector researched, curated, written all by Johnson Center staff. And then please check out Community Insight, right? Our online data platform collating over 800 million data points to help answer key questions about communities, advance equitable decision-making, and support public data access. Speaking of data, one of my favorite maxims in this work, and I know you've all heard it before, but I'll say it just again, it's my favorite, is that the numbers never, ever speak for themselves. It's kind of a weird way to open a gathering to talk about race and ethnicity data, I understand, but I think you will find this is a common thread throughout. Connecting data on housing, education, and income to race and ethnicity information restores just a little bit of life to those numbers. It begins to tell a richer story, and it points to different needs than we would otherwise see in neighborhoods and communities. And I believe this is what we're all after here today. And we've got a packed agenda. And starting 4 minutes late, thanks to me. I'm looking forward to learning more from our state partners about what exciting changes they've been making in their own offices and departments. That'll come first, right? I'm also looking forward to talking with our nonprofit and philanthropic partners about how we can assist with these changes. You also have a copy of today's agenda in your folders, just in case you're wondering, and you can't see up here. Breaks are planned throughout. A couple of notes, bathrooms are back that way. If I were you, I would avoid the gender-neutral bathroom. There appears to be a light out, and so I would just keep going a little bit farther down that hallway for the bathrooms at the back. We'll provide some light snacks here over at the table. Feel free to get up and get those anytime you need. Those are available throughout. Water is there. La Croix is there. La Croix? La Croix. Are there any questions before we get started? Great. First, I have the distinct honor to introduce Scott Powell. It's a distinct honor. I thought about that actually a lot as I was writing this down. The Chief Data Officer of the State of Michigan and Director of the Michigan Center for Data and Analytics. Scott and his team lead state efforts to enhance and promote evidence-based decision-making across state government. He has more than a decade's experience in turning data into actionable information, specializing in advanced analytics, program evaluation, and administrative data systems. Prior to joining the state of Michigan, He held appointments at the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers, where he developed multiple research projects for the state of New Jersey, as well as the University of Tennessee. And Scott is a Flint native, right? Right here, right around the corner. Please welcome Scott Powell.
I did not get my slides in on time, so we have to do a quick computer swap. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I will say there is, Aaron said that everything is going on right now at the same time. One thing that's not going on is the draft. As I'm sure you noticed when you came into the parking lot, because you're only paying $15 instead of $115, which I'm very thankful for that. Anybody make it down here for the draft? One? How was it?
Crazy.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Like 700,000 plus crazy. But a great win for the city. We're up. Good. Okay. Well, I only got 10 minutes, so let me go ahead and get my timer rolling here to make sure I don't go over. So, as Aaron said, I'm just going to jump right into it. So, I'm the Chief Data Officer for the state of Michigan. I also direct our Center for Data and Analytics. So, what I'm going to do today is tell a little bit about what we do at the center, what the center is, the work we do. But specifically, I want to get into a discussion about open data, right? The data that we have available from the state to the public, and how you can have an impact on what kind of data we have available to the public. And I'm hoping we can generate some discussion around that today. So, I think one way to think about this stuff is, what is the role of a chief data officer? So from one state to the next, this is something that can vary quite a bit. So some of my colleagues in other states complete IT. That's all they do. I'm the opposite end of the spectrum. I don't do IT. I'm a researcher by training. That's my background. My role and the role of the center is completely focused on data use. How do we use data for evidence-based decision making? How do we use data to make Michigan a better place for our residents? That's our, writ large, that's what we do at the center. We do that in a couple ways. So one of those ways is working directly with our departments. And I've got some of my colleagues here today. Brian, for instance, helps out with some of this work we do. We have a program called Strategic Data Leadership. So that's something where myself, my team, we work with every single department in state government and give them guidance on how can they make better use of the data that they have, right? How can they make better decisions with their own data? That's one piece of what we do. And think of that as, again, at the department level. The other thing the center does, though, is broader, right? Think of, big picture things that don't fit neatly into the confines of a single department in state government. Something like poverty, right? So poverty, if you want to look at poverty, if you want to really dive in, you want to find out what's driving poverty, what's working as far as solutions, what programs are getting people out of poverty, you need data from education, you need data from human services, you need data from labor, you need data from a lot of places, right? That's what we do. We bring that data together all in one place so we can holistically analyze what's going on, try to come up with better solutions. So that's another part of what we do at the center. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn a little bit more. So maybe you can read that, maybe you can't. It's just our mission statement. So in a nutshell, though, what do we do at the center? We use data to drive better decisions, right? That's what we're here for. And so if there's nothing else you take away about what we do, that's it. So obviously I work very closely with my IT partners in state government, but that's not our role. We partner with those folks, but we're not part of building that infrastructure. We get input into it, luckily. Now, how do we go about that work? We have 3 basic teams within the center. And just for the sake of today's conversation, but also going forward, if there's any opportunities for partnership, I want you all to be aware of what these 3 groups are. So one is focused on research and analytics. So that's the group that takes data, turns it into insights, right? And they might do that with public-facing data, like you're used to seeing from the Census Bureau, for instance. But they also do that with what we call administrative data, our internal data at the state. This is data that sits on our data systems. It's probably been collected for decades for purposes that didn't involve analysis for evidence-based decision-making, right? It's like something like federal reporting. But it's there, and we can use it, and we analyze it. So that's one team. Secondly, the state demographer is also part of our team at the center. So her name's Jacqueline Butler. So the demography team, right, as you can imagine, they do all things population, a very popular topic over the last year. So state's population, all the demographic groups that we're discussing today that make up that population, And then if you ever talk to a demographer, it's always an interesting experience. Births, deaths, and migration. Those are the three things that always define population, and they will hammer home on those 3 points. And we recently had a new report come out about projecting our state's population through 2050 on our website if you're interested. And then finally, we have a labor market information division, everything about the state's labor market. Nothing but, mostly open data, right, that we publicly publish unemployment rates, payroll, jobs, wages, all that stuff. That comes out of that group, right? That's a data production unit more so than it is analysis. So that's what we do as a group. What's the type of work that we do that you might want to be interested in? So we do, summaries and dashboards. How do we better understand our state programs? This is the bulk of what we do. It is nothing fancy methodologically, right? If you know anything about stats, like descriptive statistics, right? Core analytics. It's basically, who are we serving? Who are we not serving? How can we better target those groups that we want to reach? Right? That's the type of stuff we do with that first category. And that is the bulk of what folks need, both in state government and outside of state government, because either they can't get at the data that's on this antiquated old data system, or if they can get at that data, they don't have the expertise to analyze it. As Aaron just said, the data does not speak for itself, right? So you need somebody that translates that data into something actionable. Secondly, we do program evaluations. This is about what's working, right? So are programs doing what they're intended to do? Are they getting people better levels of education? Are they getting people jobs? Are they raising people's wages? This is something that we evaluate on a regular basis at the center. And then finally, we also have predictive models in place. We've been doing this for a few years now where we use, I guess prior to 18 months ago, machine learning and AI were pretty synonymous. Now AI is everything that's, large language models. But we have multiple machine learning models operating in state government, right? And what do? They better help target our efforts, support our state staff in making decisions on how they can better target what they do. So that's the type of work that we do. But the one I want to focus on today, so one thing that we're responsible for also is open data. So what is open data? It's data that's public facing, right? It's available to everyone. Data from multiple departments across state government, right? So we have, not every department, but many departments have data that's publicly posted and available for public use. Now, why do we do this? There's lots of reasons we do this, right? One is it promotes transparency, right? Obviously very, very important for government to promote transparency, get that data out there. Secondly, it promotes engagement, right? Not just with the state, not just with the data, but the programs that we have set up to better serve the people of Michigan. Right? And finally, accountability, right? Also extremely important. So it does all of these things. It's a resource for everyone, right? It's meant to be for everyone. And how do we provide that data? It's on our open data portal. So if you haven't been to it before, data.michigan.gov. So this is a site that well predates my time in my current role. But as you can see, maybe, I don't know, you can see up here, we've got some categories of, you can just search for data. You can look at things about the economy, about education, COVID, health, environment, right? But you've also got some tiles down here that are put up by each of the individual departments that have their own open data set, right? Because if some departments, my colleagues from DNR here is a good example, right? We can see DNR has their own open data pool right there. Department of Transportation, CEPI for education. Lots of groups already have data out there. We just want to point at it. But the truth is, right, this has been around for a while and it needs some love. So I'm going to come back to that point in a second. But first I want to think, why is open data important? I probably don't need to answer that because I think that's why you're here. But just as a couple examples, what are some things we can look at? So just a couple things we recently put up on our website in the last couple months. One, labor force participation. So in the last couple of years, this has been a really big focus when it comes to the labor market because unemployment has remained historically low for quite a while now. But so, we figure participation is where we can get the most leverage as far as, getting the most out of the labor market, getting people back into it. What you're seeing here is the line above, the green line, is a white individuals labor force participation rate. The dark blue line below it is black individuals. You can see if we go back to 2020, there was a massive gap in labor force participation between these two categories. And you can also see that over the last 4 years, that gap has pretty much gone away. It's widened a little bit with our most recent month of data, right? But we've closed that gap significantly, right? Which means that whites and blacks are participating in the labor force at a very similar rate, which we didn't have before, right? So this is a great success story. Could change tomorrow, but right now, right, this is a great thing we like to point at. But this is an example of how we can use not just open data, but data around different race and ethnicity categories to get an idea of, where are places we want to focus our efforts, not just in state government, but across our partners. A place where we have more work to do, another example, right, is the wage gap, pay gap between men and women. So we recently, I guess it wasn't last month because we're into May now, but in March, right, that's Women's History Month. So we had a report come out on women in the Michigan labor market. And one of the topics we covered was the pay gap. And you can see here, right, a few things that's going on. So one, you can see there's a pay gap between men and women for every racial and ethnic category that's on the chart, right? But you can also see that everybody is way behind where white, non-Hispanic males are, right? So those are two quick insights you can take away from this chart. Obviously, we have lots of work to do to close those wage gaps, and we have to do that across every one of these categories. But also building off of the theme of today, wouldn't it be great if we had more categories that we could list on this chart, right? If we had a MENA category on there, for instance. So back to open data, why it's important, right? I mentioned transparency, engagement, accountability. Engagement is the piece I would like to focus on for today, right? We're all engaging with each other. I would love it if you would engage with me and the center going forward, because as I said, the open data portal, it's been around for a long time, but it needs some love. And so we're going through a process right now where we're going to redesign it. And we're not just redesigning it so it looks nicer, we're redesigning it so it's more useful, right? So we can do as much good as possible with this site. And I would love to have your input, right? What type of data would you like to see on that open data portal? That is my call to action to all of you, and I hope that that's something that we can discuss later today. And I just realized I'm over time, so I'll just throw this up at the end. And you've got, so here's our website, michigan.gov/MCDA. You can subscribe to things that we have go out on Gov Delivery. I'll say Twitter because I still can't say X. And also we have an app that's if you want to look at. So that's it. That's it.
In addition to the keynote we just heard, Scott has very graciously agreed to sit in on our panel and answer questions at the end as well. So he'll be up for questions for anybody who wants to talk about such things as the open data portal and suggest particular data sets they'd like to see. Speaking of the panel, I do have an announcement to make. I'm afraid to say that one of the panelists we mentioned earlier in our agenda had to withdraw just last week due to another commitment coming up. Nevertheless, I am most excited to welcome Matthew Jaber-Stifler to the panel after he incredibly generously agreed to speak today with less than a week's notice. What did you say, 36 hours notice? So thank you for doing that. And we are all the more fortunate for it. We are all the more fortunate for it to have him. So over the next half hour or so, first I should really invite all the panelists up if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll kind of introduce you one by one, or if you'd rather stay seated and then I can just bring you up as we move along. But now is the time for the panel. So really over the next half hour or so, I'm just going to ask a very few questions. They're going to be very broad, allowing our panelists plenty of latitude, plenty of space to talk about their work. Work focused on racial equity, right? Geographic equity as well, and how that internal work has influenced some external programs, right? We'll then open it up to questions from all of you, right, and to conversation. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Papi Sias-Hernandez, right, who serves as the inaugural Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer in the Executive Office of the Governor. In addition to this role, Papi also serves as the Executive Director of the Office of Global Michigan, supporting immigrant and refugee integration efforts across the state. For more than 20 years, Hernandez's work of strategic change management has been at the intersection of public health, education, workforce development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the federal level, Poppy is a commissioner on the USDA Equity Commission. And I'm quite proud to say that we're practically neighbors. We both drove the entire breadth of the Lower Peninsula this morning. Well, you came from Lansing, I suppose, but you had come across in steps, the entire breadth of the Lower Peninsula just to get here. Thank you so much, Poppy. To start off, could I ask you to just tell us a little bit, and I'll sit down here. I think I'll do that. Could I ask you to tell us a little bit about your work as Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer?
Sure. So I will say that I started my work in state government at the same time that the governor started this administration. So I don't have a long history in state government, and I think that's very relevant to how I approach my work every day. My first job in state government was as the Regional Director of Community Affairs in the governor's office. And I'm sharing that because that job is really a job that is centered on equity and inclusion. Every single governor uses that external affairs lens around how to drive equity and inclusion. Some of them better than others. I would argue this one better than most. So that was my first role in state government, which is a very unique entry point because you have no idea of the ginormity, I don't think that's a word, but I do that often, of state government. You don't understand the bureaucracy that you're swimming in because the governor's office is this weird little bubble that operates very differently than the rest of the system. So I think that matters in terms of how I approach my work as the Chief Equity Officer. So I was appointed as the Chief Equity Officer. I don't even remember what year it was. It's a blur. But part of why that role was created is because the governor had issued an executive directive in her first, I want to say 30 days, that mandated equity and inclusion officers in every state department. And it had some other really key mechanisms in place that were designed to drive equity and inclusion in state government. But they were largely compliance driven, and they were interpreted across the departments. And for my fellow state colleagues, I might hurt feelings today, so just be prepared for that. It's kind of what I have to say at the beginning of every meeting that I go into. Be prepared to get your feelings hurt. My family knows the deal. But it was largely compliance driven. It was around the sort of primary mechanism that everyone grabbed onto was this discriminatory harassment complaint mechanism, which required a reporting it triggered a reporting mechanism that went all the way to the governor's office. That didn't exist prior to that executive directive, and that's the thing that everyone sort of grabbed onto because it was legal. It had a legal requirement. I bring that up because in state government, we love the law. We like it. We reference the law all the time. You'll hear us talk about statutory prohibitions, statutory requirements, but I loved what you said at the beginning of this, Aaron, when you said the numbers never speak for themselves. And I would argue that policy doesn't speak for itself. People interpret policy. People tell the stories of the numbers. And it matters who's in the room when we're interpreting policy, and it matters who's in the room when we're telling the stories about the data. So it was largely compliance focused. I was working with the chief compliance officer at that time because I had a background in DEI, but I didn't have a formal role in the implementation of that executive directive. It became quite clear within the first year or so that it was going to be difficult to move systemic change just strictly through a compliance lens. And so I was approached and asked if I would be willing to take on this role. And I was like, what's the budget? What will my team be? They were like, that's funny. So I'm a fool is what I am because I was like, it's cool. I've worked without a budget in my life and it'll be fine. So I moved into that role with a lens on what are the systemic change opportunities that we have before us with this administration, with our colleagues across state government. And it's very largely internally focused. And I have to lift that up because I think when people come to state government for resources, they really only think of us as an externally focused entity. And what our challenge is that we have to be able to do the both and. We have to be able to do the external work, but we have to drive the systemic change internally because if we don't, it's not sustained. The work isn't sustained. And so what I will say is that I think about state government through the lens of There are 60,000 people that work in state government. 60,000 people, either civil servants or contracted or consultants. The number's approximate. My job is to use that momentum to drive better equity and inclusion work across the entire state. But I begin with my colleagues in state government. That's where I begin, because I do think that's the momentum opportunity. So essentially what we did, I'm just going to share at the very beginning, what I did when I came into my role is I understood that all of these equity and inclusion officers in the departments, none of them were actual equity practitioners. Right. Not one of them. Well, that's not true. There was one, my husband, but at Civil Rights. And there was another one at Treasury who actually had the core competency as equity practitioners. But the rest of them were folks who had this title added on to their already ridiculous portfolio of work. You take a job like equity work, it's scary work. You gotta be brave. You're spending every day taking risks. You're spending every day disrupting systems. You cannot add that on to someone who already has a really full portfolio, and they also don't have the skill set. So it wasn't designed to like win. So we didn't have equity and inclusion officers that had actual bandwidth. So my first challenge was to actually, this is such an example of state government, to create that position and get it resourced at the departmental level. Which, just so you have a sense of what that means, is like, I don't control any department's budget. I don't tell any director what to do. I don't want to. But getting them to get on board with prioritizing just the minimal amount of resources for a full-time equity officer, that was a heavy lift. We had to create a civil service position. We had to create organizational bandwidth. We had to create, think about the hierarchy of every department and where they were in terms of their readiness and capacity. So that was the first big challenge. Once you have the humans in place with the core competencies, then you can start driving that systemic change. So that was the first challenge. We did that. We got them in place. So I was doing that work for about a year, entirely dedicated role, strictly from the governor's office. I moved from a reporting line that went through the chief of staff in the governor's office to the chief operations officer. So that's a really important strategic shift for the work, because it's less politically charged. I mean, as less as you can be in the governor's office, but it's less politically charged. Then about a year into that, I was asked if I would move into the role at the Office of Global Michigan, which is an executive director role in a tiny little niche department, which I essentially said, I would love to do that because I think that work is very important, but I'm unwilling to give up the work with the equity and inclusion officers. So the only way I'm willing to move into that role is if I can keep both. And in the governor's office, it's, the governor's office doesn't have a budget, right? It's a very small budget, not like departments. They were like, oh, so you're saying you're willing to do 2 jobs for 1 salary. What's the issue here? So I stayed in the role of the chief equity officer, direct report to the governor's office, was appointed as the executive director at the Office of Global Michigan, which is technically speaking a cabinet level position. So both of those positions report directly to the chief operations officer. But I'm within a department, so now I'm part of the actual state government bureaucracy, which is a good time. It's a very good time because you do learn about the systems, and most people are like annoyed by bureaucracy. Most people think it's cumbersome. They think it has all these barriers. I personally look at it as, if I can be part of creating a team, if I can be part of shifting the culture, shifting the systems, shifting the policy, shifting the narratives, then that's the best I can hope for. So in the Office of Global Michigan, so what I did, just so folks have the picture, as the chief equity officer, I had no budget, I had no staff. I had what I would describe as very sort of nebulous, informal power, because I spoke on behalf of the governor's office, which does matter to some people. But coming back to that whole bureaucracy thing, you know what I'm looking at, Regina. Like, you can show up and people know you're there on behalf of the governor. And for some people, that's like, oh, big deal. We're going to do this. And for other people, it's like, We'll wait. That's literally what people think. So you have to think about that, but I had no budget, no staff. When I moved into the Office of Global Michigan, now I can actually do budget advocacy to get money, to have staff, and to do the actual work. And it's nothing personal about philanthropy, but I spent the first 20 years of my career depending upon philanthropy to get the work done. I don't think state government should depend on philanthropy to get the work done. I think we should be funding philanthropy to do the work. I said it out loud. But I also think it can be a good partnership. But I wanted a budget appropriation to do the work because I needed to support those civil servant positions. So that's what I spent the first year at the Office of Global Michigan doing. I came into a department, very small, 12 people. Their work was almost 90% focused on refugee and immigrant resettlement. Secondarily, we had ethnic commissions. I took the team from 12 to 30 because I knew we couldn't really do the work without having more capacity. I centered the work of equity and inclusion within our department, building a team around that. And I integrated the ethnic commissions into that work more fully, and also the refugee services work into that more fully. So I'm thinking not just about the humans doing the work, but about the dollars that are going to support the work. So when I started at the Office of Global Michigan as the Chief Equity Officer, still reporting to the governor's office, I had no budget. Now I have a budget of somewhere in the range of $15 million state appropriated, and somewhere in the range of $70 million federally appropriated. And I consider all of that money equity and inclusion work. It's tied to different kinds of things, but it should all be driving equity and inclusion. So I feel like I talked for too long, but I needed you all to know the ridiculousness of how dynamic and agile the work has to be. And we're in it, but it's quite messy. It's not perfect. And I love that you started with the quote around the numbers never speak for themselves, because that is, for me, the big takeaway around how we think about our work. Because I will tell you that when I left the governor's office, one of the most shocking aspects, when I say I left the governor's office, what I'm talking about is the daily work of being involved in the governor's office. Now I'm in a department. One of the most shocking aspects for me was I left a team that was incredibly diverse. And I went into state government, and I was often the only minority in the room, the only person of color at the table. So I don't think that you have to have representation in every room, but you should have representation of diverse thoughts and pathways. So that has to be there in order for the policy to be good. So like when Scott was talking about the numbers, my brain immediately, I don't know if the other people of color in the room, if this happened for you, but I literally was like, did you do this with it? Did you disaggregate it this way? I'm curious, like when you show the numbers for black and white, I just have to tell you, like what happens to me is when my son was in middle school and he was in his history class and he came home from school one day and he literally said to me, when do I get to be in the history books? When do I get to see my people's history in the history books? And I was like, I think you might have to tell those stories, baby. Like, I don't know what the answer to that question is. But I will tell you all that I'm asking it in every single meeting. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my spiel and I'm sticking to it. Yes. Okay, good. You're fired up. Good.
Okay, I had a whole bunch of other questions.
Okay, I think I answered them all in that one blob. Yes,
Woo,
yes.
You got it.
Sign me up for 2 times.
If I could follow up with one point, I'm very interested in what you just said about using bureaucracy for your own ends, right? I think bureaucracy is often talked about, absolutely, instinctively, right? I do the same as the wall, right? Like, we were just talking about this a minute ago, right? Just bureaucracy is the wall. How do you think what would be one way, I won't even say the best way, but what would be one way we could use bureaucracy in this way, like you say, to create systemic change, to pursue that equity data, right? So again, looking at race and ethnicity data, having more categories included, right? Aligning the state's data categories with the new federal ones. We'll talk about that later, but just a little preview. How do you think you can use bureaucracy in that way? Like, what do you see as the strategy there?
I think you have to keep your eyes on the prize, and the people that are in the room that have been doing this so much longer than me have a way better vision around it. I just kind of show up and figure out where I can get wins.
Yeah.
That's how I move on things.
Yeah.
But I think you really have to live in the both and space of like, what's the big ticket win that we want, which is getting Scott Powell to collect the data the way we want him to, right? Because he's the pinnacle, right? When I say getting him to do it, I don't mean literally getting him to do it, but like, getting the policy change at that top level of the hierarchy. But then the and is thinking about it at a departmental level. So that's the incremental change. So there are departments that have more of a readiness, more capacity, expertise, the competency around using an equity lens. And they actually they're strongly motivated to do it because they can't really do their work if they're not doing that. So that's how we approach it from an equity officer lens. We literally are like, which departments are at the table right now that have a clear line of vision about how having disaggregated, having data that's collected through an equity lens will improve the quality of their work. You can make the argument that that's true for every single department in state government, obviously, but there are some that are getting into trouble because they're not doing it.
Yeah.
So that's, I would say it's the both and. It's the what's the big ticket win, who can work on that, and then who can work on the incremental building, because that is looking through the bureaucratic lens. Because what happens is the more departments you get on board, the easier that's that momentum, right? That's that flow that happens. So that would be my answer to that. Also, you're building an army.
Yeah.
Right? You're building an army because one of the things that I encounter is a high level of resistance around change. That is the big challenge of the bureaucracy, is it's change resistant. So, I mean, I'm saying that mildly, right? So it's resistant to change. So the people are the ones that are resistant to change. And they're resistant to change because of those statutory, that sort of preoccupation with law. They've been taught as civil servants that if we break the law, we have problems. And that's true, right? So we need to follow the law. But that's why it's so important to bring them in, because then they keep you legal and you're able to drive change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I would love to add to that.
Yeah,
just
please.
Yes,
just
by all
based
means,
on what I heard
please.
from
Yeah.
Poppy, because got excited. Like I said, I want to be part of Team Poppy. So, but I think what I heard you talk about too is, policy can be rewritten, right? Administrations will change. And as I've gone on in my career, I think, what am I going to leave? What's the impact I'm going to have? Used to be brick and mortar, used to be, programs, but it's the people, right? So the influence that you're going to have on this group of people that you're interacting with, and what are they going to do when we're all going to move on at some point, right? But that's part of that lasting impact on the opportunity that you have right now to influence people in positions that'll be there perhaps beyond. So,
Absolutely. I say all the time I'm a temp because I'm an appointee. So the folks that I'm working with every day, they're going to be there long after I'm gone. So I take that very seriously because I think I'm not going to be there to manage all the things. I shouldn't be. Also, just the whole approach of moving with equity and inclusion, it's acknowledging the gifts, the talent, the challenges in the room, in the city, in the county, in the state, in the country. So if I'm actually doing that, then I'm acknowledging that I don't have to do all the things. I don't have to know all the things. I do think that is one of the biggest challenges around working with an equity lens, is that the issues are so charged that it makes folks cautious and afraid that they're going to make mistakes. And I heard this quote yesterday. I love it. I just want to write it everywhere. It said, "Don't stress yourself out about making the right decisions. Don't stress about making the right decisions. Stress about, oh, dang it. Making the decisions right. Making the decisions right." So it's about the process.
Yeah.
It's really about the process. That nobody likes that because everybody wants the outcome. But I focus on how we're making the decisions.
What you do after you make that decision.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so
I wanna
much.
be done talking.
This is a panel. We're supposed to be
I know,
talking,
you
right?
guys talk.
This is absolutely perfect, yeah. Before we continue on, I do want to introduce our next panelist and hear a little bit more so we can keep the conversation going. But thank you so much, Poppy, for taking the time and sharing that with us. There will be time for questions and answers at the end as well. Dan, you spoke up. Let's go next. I have the pleasure of introducing Dan Lord, the Finance and Operations Division Chief at the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Dan has been with the DNR since 2003. Prior to that, he worked for several private consulting firms as a landscape architect and planner. While with the DNR, Dan has held various roles, including serving as the program manager for capital planning and development within the state park system, serving as the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator, and leading asset management efforts for the department. In Dan's current role, and pay attention to anybody who wants to talk to him later, his team has department-wide responsibilities, including no less than, and this is a long list, but we're just going to do
It's
it.
a potpourri.
Budget, finance, audit, procurement, facilities, oil, mineral, gas exploration, real estate, and what I think we'll talk most about today, public-facing grant programs. Welcome, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I just want you to know I have both the website queued up and the screenshots in case the website fails. So
Okay.
you let me know, and I'll go over there and
Okay.
Move things around.
Screenshots will probably be just.
then I will pass this to you. You just click
Are
through
you
them.
presenting?
I've got some visual aids.
Oh my
You've got some
gosh.
visual aids. He
We'll
came
talk a little bit about
Whatever.
very prepared.
data, right?
Oh my goodness. I'm like, okay,
I'm
Excited
excited.
Where's
about
my
data
slide deck?
sometimes, but-
I got no.
you got no
I got
slide deck?
nothing.
Okay, good. I feel less.
I don't have to, but I'm a visual person, so sometimes putting some things on the screen can help. But maybe just to get to know the audience a little bit, like just governmental type of agencies. I just want to make sure who I'm talking to. Okay, philanthropy.
Got the
Some
two
friends
big
back
shots
there
back
for
there.
sure.
That's right.
Yep,
Big
yep.
shots.
Yeah.
Big shots in the room.
NGOs is the rest of the room, I'm guessing. Okay. All right. Well, there's some others out there, but I'll might be a little bit of a storyteller here for maybe why I'm here and what I'm going to talk about. But I'll kind of back up and kind of reverse a little bit of Poppy. So I've been with government for 20 years, right? And I'm surprised I'm still here some days because my machete gets a little dull from the red tape of the bureaucracy. But I think what's driven me through my career is trying to get to a place to be able to, instead of inform the decisions or influence them, like actually be at the table to help make some of them. So that's kind of driven me. And Poppy talked about, the power of numbers, the power of programs, the power of people. There's a lot of resources, especially the last couple of years, out there in terms of funding. But I think that's what gets me excited sometimes is when you can get the right people at the table and get the right mix of problem solving, idea generation, and solutions. At the end of the day, I pride myself in being a public servant, like in an agency that our biggest asset is our land, our footprint. 4.6 million acres across the state, but as we've also, we use our little hand maps, right? Like a lot of that's north of the knuckles, as we talk about, right? So Claren north, but what can we be as an agency to communities at a different level, a different scale? So right in the backyard here, the Detroit Riverfront is a great example of the last 10 years, how we've invested in different ways. And it's not the normal, we do have the OAC and a presence on Belle Isle, but the riverfront, land ownership is a base layer, but partnerships layered and leveled on top of that. I'm from Flint as well, so I'm a non-traditional DNR guy. I like to tell people I grew up shooting hoops, not guns. So up until recently, there was no DNR presence in Genesee County, but the Flint State Park, again, another model for our agency to have a presence and support of communities, different way of doing things. So I've kind of slid in at the DNR at a good time where, had some directors that have been open-minded and willing to look at doing some things differently and recognize what we bring as an agency to the table. So excited to be here today. I'm going to watch Aaron mindfully because I can go down a rabbit hole here with this story, but
ignored him.
I'll look for cues. Yeah. Moving on. So yeah, I'm going to wear the grants hat for the most part, and I brought some friends today. So if you want to engage in conversations or breakouts, I'll call some people on. We've got Robin Africans, who our DEI coordinator for the department. Again, looking to embed at the executive level, a leadership role. She's got some of her support group here today as well. Clay Summers kind of crossed over from the NGO world, used to be the executive director for Michigan Recreation and Park Association, and now serving in that grants role. So fun to have Clay on board and coming to the other side, so to say. We've got Beth Foltz from our marketing and outreach division, so media communications, how we use some data, and then our heavy data guys pointed out earlier is Brian Mackey. So glad they could be here because I thought it'd be a fun conversation. So I'm going to talk about the Michigan Spark Grant Program, which was funded by way of the American Rescue Plan Act, so all kinds of federal funding coming to the state. We are fortunate to get a chunk of funding, a big chunk going to the Detroit Joe Louis Greenway that we're excited to work with the city on. And part of that was intended to be a new public grant program. And I'll be honest, like when it first came out, in these tight timelines, like the knee-jerk reaction is like, okay, how are we going to move this on top of our other programs? So our big three traditional programs that invest in land and recreation are the Natural Resources Trust Fund program, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and Recreation Passport. They all do pretty much the same thing. They support our eligibility pool as local units of government for the most part, but we look to acquire land and help build parks and trails at the end of the day. And we saw this as an opportunity to do something different. And I think that was really important to get that level of support from the top. Part of it had to do with what have we heard over the years about our programs and our processes? What have we seen internally? So really a bit of an experiment to try to think about delivering differently, but staying true to, at the end of the day, dollars are supposed to go to the communities that are negatively impacted from COVID-19. So it started with kind of expanding the table, right? Stakeholder groups, where do we need to listen before we run? And we have our traditional partners, as I mentioned, like MParks and the Michigan Trails and Greenway Alliance. But we wanted to invite some non-traditional partners to the table, and this is where we started to overlap with Philanthropy because we've done some really good things in Detroit with entities like the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, the Council of Michigan Foundation. So Regina's back in the room there. We invited them to the table, Michigan Municipal League. So diversifying who we're going to talk to help build the program. And what we wanted to do was I'll say, remove a lot of the barriers from the program itself because it takes a lot for a community to apply for a grant. All of our programs, per statute, there's a match requirement. So
He said per statute. He said it very quietly. You hear that? You heard that?
Take some
Everybody heard that?
change, yeah.
Per statute. That's his way of saying legally.
Legally. So how do we play in some gray areas of legally? But how do programs get established?
Yes.
By the interpretation. So back to Spark getting established, we were very specific to insert nonprofit organizations that provide recreational support at a community scale as a possible eligible applicant. So that was a really big insertion to give us some space to play because we know that at the end of the day, it's not just local governments that stand these projects up, it's partnerships. And we also know that at the end of the day, back to the communities we're trying to serve, capacity is a huge challenge, right? You might have a city manager, a clerk who's doing 10 different things. They don't have time to go write a grant, pursue the funding, chase down everything. And applying is actually kind of the easy part. It's implementing and executing. So we wanted to have out of the gates some flexibility. We got some help from the legislature, but we had this group come together and let's cut away. So our normal program, 17 to 20 different categories, which means all kinds of supporting documents. And we landed on 6. And I'll rattle off those 6 because they kind of lead into the data side. So public benefit and anticipated outcomes, a little bit of the narrative. How did COVID impact your community? How will this project help? Financial and social considerations, which is going to play into, I've got the clicker here, some of the data side. Access to project site, and we wanted to look at that differently in terms of population. So our traditional programs, big 2 data sets we use are median household income and population. And that drives a lot of scoring, right? So based upon where your community falls, you get a certain level of points. But this particular program, we looked at access, meaning where's this pin on the map? Where's this park? And within a 10-minute radius, what's the portion of population that could get to this site without a personal vehicle? Not every community has public transportation. So really, who's this going to impact at kind of that neighborhood scale? We took that median household income and the ALICE data set by way of United Way. I'm seeing some heads nod. So again, a different way to look at a census block level, again, down to that community level of what's happening, data-wise. What's the data showing us? Where should we be making some of these strategic investments? I'll maybe just pull up a couple visuals that give you guys a walkthrough. I know the text is small, so a little bit you can see some of the data sets that we pulled from. So the other one I think is important to mention, and the combination of data is CDC places. So a lot of times we look at our recreation programs.
Oh, really quickly, for those who can't see the screen, we also did print out these screenshots, and there should be a copy on every table. It might be a little blurry, but there are copies on the table as well. So, sorry.
Yeah, no, not a problem. So CDC, they actually collect information looking at physical and mental well-being of a community. So I think what we've learned over the years is, recreation, the DNR, we're hunting, fishing, camping, right? That's usually what we're known for. But let's let the community define what recreation or physical or mental well-being means to them. Let's not put a score on this is what it needs to be. Really don't prescribe it. Tell people what they believe it should be. So that was another important data set. And then the percentage of parkland or percentage of public land. So thinking about that concept of a park desert, right? Certain communities have a lot of it, some have none. And again, our traditional programs, we reward high quality natural resources, right? Great Lakes shoreline, trout streams, these things that, again, you don't find in every community. So just looking at land and public space, that's an asset, right? Like, what could that space be? I talked about the access one. All of this information is out on our website. So behind the scenes, right, we're just asking for what's the location, what's your narrative, 6 categories. We're going to try to keep the scoring simple. We removed match. Right, so this was, again, we didn't have to require match.
Big deal.
We raised the threshold to $1 million. We have what's called a conversion, where if you have grant funding from us in the past, that land is encumbered. If it's ever sold or used in a different way, you get point deductions, you get penalized. This is going to trickle down from the National Park Service and the federal program. A lot of times, communities go through changes over time. Land is an asset, land has value, they've sold. So some of the communities we're trying to help are actually getting negative points on our applications. Let's set that aside. Let's not even look at that. So when you start to assemble the data, you can see maybe on your paper scoring, right? So again, back to some very particular categories. We want to take it out some of the subjectivity of whoever's reviewing the application, and let's let this pin on the map reflect, again, community need at the end of the day. So there's some of the mental health. What this kind of started to gravitate towards was this other concept of opportunity communities. So when you assemble all this data, and I talked about the census block, but if you roll it up to the community, the municipal boundary. So at a project level, we're scoring based upon, one side of the road could be a completely different community than the other. So we wanted to give points where they were due. But when you assemble it and look at a community, what does that ranking look like across all the communities within the state of Michigan? And this is where the conversations got really interesting with some of our stakeholders. I got to give a shout out as well to the Governor's Office of Foundation Liaison, who from the get-go helped kind of stand this up behind the scenes, open some doors, expand conversations, align support. Karen Alder-Deason was a confidant in a lot of separate chats about, oh boy, are we going to do this? Let's do it, and pushing forward. But this list, nobody really argued with the names of the communities on the list. It was really kind of where we had to draw the line.
Yeah.
And so this cumulative scoring and this ranking system, you can do it different ways. I think there's probably more data sets that other people here know, but back to kind of a program of doing things different and eventually a partnership to put funding with the Council of Michigan Foundations to leverage the foundation network to even do it a little bit even more differently. So 27.5 million out of 65 million, we entrusted with another partner to work with communities in a different way and to distribute. So I don't know if I can break news, but I'll just say like this list up here was in the back minds of not only our decision making internally with the DNR, but also with CMF. So not only kind of the scoring, the data, how you evaluate, but how do you align with other entities to distribute those funds? So I'll put a cork in it there and revisit some of my notes, but I'm sure there's other things. I'll stop, but I think that's part of why we were asked to be here today. One last thing, and I'll stop.
Yeah, please.
We're also in this sweet spot because, ARPA's going to come and go. General fund's getting tight, right?
Yeah.
We have these traditional programs, etched in statute. One of them is in the state's constitution, so it requires a vote of the public. It's kind of hard to change sometimes. But changes can be made. It was opened up 2 years ago. Every time it's been opened up, the people show up and they support their public spaces. They support kind of recreation and what makes Pure Michigan, right? And so we're excited to be at the table. We're excited to be helping make changes through communities. And our traditional 3 programs this year, it's our 5-year review of what's our normal criteria. How do we score? How do we evaluate? What do we ask for? And I think playing in the gray space, right, back to capacity and the ability to execute, recognizing partnerships. We're flirting with the concept of, can we blend in administrative support and actually put some funding out there, because we know that there's networks out there that want to support their local communities. That's their role. That's what they're there for. How do we incentivize that in some way to, maybe springboard more applications from not only the 39 communities behind me, but the other ones that are right off that cutting line. So take a breath and a sip of water.
There we go. Look at that. Perfect.
Amazing.
I don't need this.
Okay.
You don't have a slide deck, Matthew?
I asked Dan to make you all look bad, so he did very well.
He had a handout, he had
I
slides.
know, I'm like.
I didn't do the handout. Thank you for that support.
Thank you so much, Dan. And what I'm hearing, I guess I'm picking up a couple of things really quickly before we move on, and that is one thing I want to really highlight that you pointed out was, and this is something that we've talked about with folks from the Office of Foundation Liaison and CMF as well, but look for the difference between what is required by law or statute, right? And what has just always been done, right? And can be changed. You mentioned interpretation, right? Where are there interpretation changes?
Yes.
So I wanted to highlight that. And then also just point out that there are now 2 offices, right? The Center for Data and Analytics and the Department of Natural Resources poised to make some change to the way they're doing business, right? So some change to the open data portal, some change to grant making, grant criteria evaluation. Looking for input, right, from people in the room. So just pointing that out here. Let's move on to our third panelist.
Yep.
Thank you again, Matthew. Matthew is the director of the Center for Arab Narratives, a new national research institution through Access, the largest Arab American community nonprofit in the country and based next door in Dearborn. Matthew is also the research and content manager at the Arab American National Museum. And prior to these roles, he served as a lecturer in Arab and Muslim American Studies for 10 years at the University of Michigan. He's a former board member of the Arab American Studies Association and serves on the executive board of Michigan Humanities. Welcome, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you, great to be here. I'm going to take a page from Dan and ask some questions of the audience here. So I'm going to be talking about MENA, Middle Eastern North African community in Michigan, and data around it. So my question is, raise your hand if you are very familiar with what MENA is and how the data of the MENA community functions within the state of Michigan. Hands up if you're like on top of this. All right.
I mean, I want to say
Couple of folks.
I'm on
Okay.
top of it, Matthew, but I'm
I think
nervous
you're
because I'm
good.
sitting next to you.
Raise your hand if you at least have heard MENA, Middle East, North African. You know it's a new thing, a newer thing in the state. Okay, so at least we're there. I'll try to make sure my terminology is clear when I'm talking about this. But just for my background, I'm a humanities scholar who has gotten involved with access and working with the statewide community and working with our partners at the state around collecting better data on our community. My colleague here, Rima Maraway from National Network of Arab American Communities, does much more of the sort of advocacy, policy work, and we work very closely together. So she may be able to answer some questions better than me, so I'm glad to have her here. So just a general sort of overview of the work.
Well, so
Or do you want to launch into a question?
I have questions, but I can also open
He's
the
afraid to
floor
ask
you
them
here.
now after mine.
Not at all. Not at all. Could you just tell us a little bit about some of your data-centered work right at the state level? You just start there. We'll start there.
Yeah, so I've been in the role of what I'm doing now, which is working with, among other things, working with state agencies, mainly around public health, and trying to make sure that the Middle Eastern North African community in the state of Michigan is not only counted, but counted in a way and reported in a way that we can have actionable materials, intervene in health issues and health crises. And, you might know that Michigan has one of the largest Arab and Middle Eastern populations in the country. It's a very visible population. And about 10, 12 years ago, the state Department of Health and Human Services did make sort of headlines when they started counting the Arab community. They added an Arab question onto a lot of the health forms and things that they collected. And then after the Arab question was there for a few years, the Chaldean community, which is a large Iraqi Christian community in Michigan, said, okay, we get the Arab question, but we don't necessarily identify as Arab. Can you include us too? So then some agencies started saying Arab and Chaldean. So the question would be, are you Arab or Chaldean? Then the federal government's like, well, we're going to do a box that we're going to call Middle East North African, which encompasses Arab and Chaldean, but actually includes like Iranian and other communities that might not see themselves as Arab or Chaldean. And so that picks up with my work about 5-6 years ago, is working with state agencies. If they did have an Arab box, pushing them to make it MENA, and if they didn't collect either Arab or Chaldean or anything like that, pushing to add a MENA box. So we've been meeting with people from everything from the Secretary of State to people at the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, the Michigan or the Disease Surveillance System, immunization folks, the state demographers, the last few in the last 5 or 6 years. So really just coming to the table and saying, look, we know Michigan has this amazing MENA community. We would love to have some sort of actionable data on it, and just having meeting after meeting. And what happens is every time in the first meeting, whoever we're talking to in the agency is like, yes, we need the data. We want the data. We're going to add a MENA box in some way. And then they go and they have their meetings with their systems managers and the people that run the software. And then a few months later, they come back and say, actually, we can't do that. Our software is outdated. Or because we report to the federal government and the federal government only wants A, B, and C, we can't collect it. So it can get frustrating working with the bureaucracy. But we kept at it, and we got some data at some agencies. And then, what happened about 6 weeks ago, less than 2 months ago, something major happened at the federal level, which the Office of Management and Budget, which controls the race and ethnicity standards for the whole country, changed the race and ethnicity standards for the first time in 26 years. And what they did is the box that you're used to, which is like, are you Hispanic or Latino? And then the second question is, are you white, black, Asian, Native, Pacific Islander, or other? They changed it, and there's a great visual in your packet. This is what it is now, okay? This is the new federal standard. Any federal agency that collects race and ethnicity data now has to use this form beginning in 5 years. They have 5 years to implement. They have a year to draft a plan for how they'll implement, and they have 5 years to change the race and ethnicity standards. The two big changes on here are the addition of a MENA box, a Middle East North African box, which is now going to be disaggregated from the white racial box, which is where almost all MENA communities have been for 40, 50 years. And you'll see they did what they call it as the combined question. It's no longer the two separate questions of are you Hispanic or Latino, and then what race are you? It's now what race or ethnicity are you? And it's one question. So it's a much more streamlined version. I think it's going to produce much better data for all communities, not just the MENA community, which is what Rima and her team pushed when there was the federal comment period on these proposed standards. So our job now, moving forward, is to work with the state of Michigan and say, well, the feds changed their standards. How about now we change all of our standards? And I can talk about the nitty gritty about that if you want. But that's where we're at now. And now our conversation is not, will you please add a MENA box? The conversation is, you're going to have to real soon. Let's work with what that looks like. What are the different ways that you can collect it that are that will resonate with the community and those kinds of things. So that's where we're at now. And it's an exciting time, but also we know it's going to be a lot of work ahead of us.
So I do want to talk about that nitty gritty, and I'm hoping if no one else asks about it, I absolutely will ask about it. First, though, I want to know.
Let's just celebrate.
Oh,
Let's just celebrate.
Absolutely, right?
Big win, okay? I saw you, Regina. I feel like that is one of the things we don't do in this work, is we don't pause and go like, that's a win. Mm-hmm. Let's keep it moving. Let's keep building on that. We typically are like, well, now we got this, right? It's like, that's so us right there.
Yeah.
So I just feel like,
that.
because it's the both and.
Yeah.
It helps create the momentum that motivates state government to drive the policy that needs to happen. Because every time someone said to you, we can't do that, that what they were actually saying is, we don't want to do it. And it's not personal. It makes us uncomfortable to do it.
It's too much work.
It makes us, I don't even experience it as it's too much work and maybe that's it. But I try to assume positive intent. I'm just like, it's too hard. It's going to result in us there's going to be lots of barriers. Because state government is so hierarchical, it's like everywhere, depending where you are in the system, every directive comes with a whole truckload of challenges around like, I don't know if that's within my authority or I don't know. But yeah, I feel like I oftentimes hear we're uncomfortable with that. When I go into the meeting. A lot of the times we're uncomfortable with what you're asking for. And then I have to say, like, good. Like, we're at a good place right now. We should all be uncomfortable. And then I'm like, okay, what makes you uncomfortable? But I'm willing to have those conversations. I think it's harder to have those conversations when you're an external partner.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Unless you are bringing resources, then it's a little bit easier to have them. But if you're coming in and the thing that you're bringing forward is going to require resources,
100%.
then it creates a whole different level of resistance. So but yes, winning, Rima. Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry, Aaron.
No. This is fantastic. I actually just wanted to know what will this mean then? So we get the nitty gritty. We get through it. Let's just look out to the next step. What will this mean for MENA communities in the state? Right? What will having, let's just say, federal, data standards, which we'll talk more about in a little bit if some of you are lost, are applied in Michigan. What is that going to mean?
It means that a community that everybody who lives in Michigan knows there's this large Arab and MENA community. Everybody knows where they are. They know their favorite restaurants, right? But people ask me, how many are there? I'm like, I don't know. What are their issues? We're not really sure. Are there health disparities? Probably. We need to figure those out. We just don't have really good, solid data on the community. This will mean that the community is no longer left out of those conversations. We will not only know the issues, we'll be able to develop policies and procedures to address the issues. And so it's a game changer for not only the community in Michigan, but nationwide. But it's a great chance for Michigan to lead the nation on this because everybody looks to Michigan's Arab community and MENA community for like, what do we do now? Because we have such, not only just a huge number, but they're very active and the profile of the community is very large in the national view. So we've got some great opportunities to push forward and it's not just about our community. So the slides you put up about the labor participation. So it's fascinating because when you disaggregate the large MENA population from white, which in Michigan it's somewhere between 300 and 400 some thousand MENA folks. As a whole, the MENA community in Michigan is about 4 or 5 points less than the white population in labor participation. So what happens to that number for the white community when you take the MENA community out of it? So then all communities start to have a more accurate representation of what the issues are. And so that's why we've been pushing for the data disaggregation of the MENA community from the white box for many years.
It just sounds wrong when you say it. I'm sorry. I know you don't mean it that way, but yes. But I do feel like it's part of the, like, when you're thinking about the data, I always am nervous when I'm in a room with people like Scott, because it's nothing personal, Scott, but like they're really in the weeds and they're really used to using the numbers to justify the decisions that they're making. And it's intimidating when you are coming into the space as sort of a disruptor, because you don't even always know what the numbers are. You don't know the right questions. You're kind of, you're on an exploration. And so, and you're dealing with issues that are really charged. So like, I love watching the journey of the MENA process, because I've been in multiple rooms where it's been being discussed. How should we identify? Because how we identify ethnically and racially is deeply personal, but it's also really externally facing. And I'm just gonna talk about my own people. Like, you can survey 100 people of Latin descent and they're gonna say, I'm not of Latin descent, right? Like, I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, I'm Latinx, I'm Latine. Like, it's gonna be very varied. And that's true with MENA communities also. And so then you can get bogged down by that. So you have to kind of make the decision that we're gonna prioritize progress over perfection. We're not gonna let perfection get in the way. And people get their feelings hurt. Again, I said at the very beginning of this, like, I hurt feelings a lot, but like, how do we move the needle? That's the question that we have to pretty consistently ask ourselves. Please.
So the one thing, and I agree with you.
Yes.
Celebrating the success of
Yes.
having this category. I do think it is going to be an important education campaign
Yes.
about check all that applies.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
that was the other piece that was added by O&B. And just understanding the history in this country when we talk about race and ethnicity, it is really, really important that everybody also has an opportunity to be seen, and that we also think about race.
Yes.
And so it's going to be important that people check all that apply. So,
Yes.
Afro-Latinos, there have been some concerns about
Yes.
what it means with
Yes.
this combination.
Yes.
I think it's really important that we kind of lay it all out on the table, but more importantly, in the education, and as folks are self-identifying, right, or, completing forms, self-identifying, that we are very clear that it is all that apply.
But I think, to your point, I'm a fan of that approach, because I think that approach says we're committed to being racially conscious. The historical approach is, it's scary, let's not talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how we can get to the data that we need to make the decisions that we need to make in terms of policy without having to ask the hard questions or get to the nuance. So, I mean, I'm a fan. I don't think it will be perfect. I think it will be messy. I think there will be gaps, but I think it's moving the needle in the right direction. So, but I appreciate that flag. It comes up every single time I've talked about this topic with people. I'm sorry, Aaron, go.
Yeah, I'm trying to move
when
the
Regina
slide.
puts her hand up, I have to
No, absolutely.
call on her
Yes,
because
this is
I know
Q&A.
she's gonna
This is
add
general
value, and
Q&A.
I'm
Yep.
like,
Yep, I'm trying to move the slide. It's getting sticky, so we'll just, it is
okay,
Q&A.
okay,
All right.
okay, yeah.
Q&A. All right. Go ahead.
Oh, you and me? Okay.
Yeah, you have your hand raised, yeah.
So to Regina's point, absolutely. I actually think it's not going to work if and I say that to the philanthropists in the room, but as well as the government people who are going to be thinking about Census 2030, if communities are not provided the resources to be able to do that outreach work around the census, people are not going to know check all that apply, because that check all that apply is kind of the key to this working, right? And if people don't, they're not going to do that. But also what I would like to add to that is there is one particular issue about where there is kind of this fine line between let's not, focus on the perfection and rather make this change. There's a Somali and Sudanese community that everybody, right after this happened, everybody was like, oh, we didn't include Somali and Sudanese in MENA. That's not a great, we need to make sure that that's in there. When, if there were any Somali or Sudanese in the room, a lot of the Somali and Sudanese groups are saying, no, a lot of Somalis and Sudanese don't consider themselves Arab. So we actually prefer the way it is now. It gets aggregated separately, and we have the option of checking MENA and Black if they consider themselves both Black and Arab. So that was actually an issue with Afro-Arabs as well. But there's one question, the actual question that I had is more around, what was your quote that data doesn't speak?
Oh, numbers never speak for themselves.
Never speak for themselves. So I just want to point, one of the slides that you had up there is the removing, the data shows that we're removing barriers, right? That there is, the gap is getting smaller. The problem with that is that narrative that those numbers tell is that we're somehow closing the gap in that we're removing systemic barriers. Whereas for most of us who are in, on the ground with people, we know barriers aren't systemic barriers are not being removed, but rather you have someone consciously pumping resources into communities to be able to close that gap. That's very different than are we actually removing barriers. And so the data in this case doesn't tell you that narrative, it doesn't tell you that story. So it's important that with the data we are looking at, and so I guess my question is, how do we do that? How do we make sure that this data is not telling the wrong story, but rather it's showing that, hey, if we actually pump resources, if people are allowed to, and we're removing these systemic barriers, it could be this. However, right now, that's not what's actually happening. It's just that you happen to have people pumping money into resources into communities.
A couple thoughts, I guess. I mean, one, I would say we always try to be very careful about the story that we tell with the data, right? And I think in that case, right, I think the story would be like, this is what's happening with the gap. I'm not commenting on what's causing it. We do separate work. So I had one slide up to like the levels of analysis that we do and the work that we do, right? So that kind of second level down, we could dig deeper and say like, maybe what is driving this reduction in the gap. We do look at that sometimes, just depends on the topic, but we do, I guess, more than anything, I guess, so we try to be very careful, because I totally agree with you on the importance of that, and we try to be very careful about not overstating what the data, what we think the data is saying. So there's that piece. I think the other piece I would throw out there is we're always open to feedback about additional data elements that could be collected that could help us answer that question. So with the barriers piece, for instance, right, like we get a pretty good amount of data from the Labor Department on the workforce development system on barriers. A lot of them are self-identified though, right? There's other ways we could be measuring these things. So I can go on and on about that, but I think that's probably the two things I would say. One, we try to be very careful, totally agree. But also, if people have ideas about how we can add more data elements to better tell a fuller story, we're always open to that.
What do you
think? Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's totally been my experience too with all of the data folks at the state. It's like, tell us how we could do this better. What are we missing? I mean, I think you don't get into that line of work unless you have just like this pretty avid curiosity. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, the only thing I would add or expand is back to the open data portal, right? So yeah, numbers don't lie. We've always heard that, but you can tell different stories with the numbers. So making the data available, letting other groups and entities digest, consume, use that data back to help inform decisions, right? I think maybe that's a proper role to play, and rather than interpretation, like, okay, help us figure out how to collect it. We'll put it out, people consume it, analyze it, and come back to inform policy decision makers. This is what we're seeing.
Yeah. Dorothy.
I think Ashley had her hand.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm not properly scanning the room. Okay, Ashley. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
This is I guess a follow-up kind of on the check all out of the pie, and putting on like my own personal hat as well as that of a researcher. that I think it's amazing that we're collecting this additional information and to see how far we've come in terms of having check all boxes. I think it'll be really interesting for us as researchers, as we report out, to make sure that we don't erase that disaggregation on the reporting side. So as someone who could check Afro, Latino, white, and as a researcher, I see so often where we have, okay, well, we need to keep the longitudinal data. So we're just gonna erase the check all and just put people back into buckets. Or we don't have enough data collected, so we're putting everybody into the other bucket and erasing their names or not even calling out the fact that we don't have sufficient data and we need to do better data collection, or we need to do a deeper dive into those communities. So as we get this deeper level of information on the communities, I think it's also equally important to reflect on our reporting that we do and how we can honor the need to look longitudinally, but also represent the progress that we've made in identifying and understanding the many identities that people can have. And to that point around storytelling, that impacts the story. If one state agency is grouping folks together based off of their reporting requirements and another is doing it differently, to your point around how the story about, what's happening within white employment might change as you can wean it out, right? If someone's reporting one way about Latino community versus Black, being intentional about what that looks like and how you maintain that disaggregation is important. Maybe it's more of a statement than a question, but I'm curious how you guys are thinking about the reporting and kind of as you adopt these new standards, how that impacts the reporting.
Yeah, part of the issue is the collection has to be more detailed. So if you look at this example in here, we're not sure if every agency at the federal level is going to go this far with the detailed checkboxes. They're really only required to have the 7 high-level checks. And for the MENA community, if Michigan does the same thing where the form is just says MENA and you check it and that's all we know, that'll give us some information. But we know within our own community that depending on if you're an immigrant or not, depending on if your family's from Yemen or Lebanon, we know there's disparities there. So that's going to hide, not having the detailed data collection is going to hide a lot of disparities. Not as many as that are being hidden now, but it's not going to be perfect. So not only do we have to push just to implement the new boxes, we need to push agencies to do the extra step and have the detailed data collection, which will allow then for the sort of like aggregate reporting or the disaggregated reporting you're talking about.
But I think part of what you lifted up for me is that it won't matter if you have all those details if you don't have continuity across the systems around how you interpret and use the details. And I think the focus needs to be across that system, not just getting the bucket of data. Because I will tell you, it is quite shocking to me how much data we have in state government. Wow, it's a lot of data. And you are 100% right on about how we use that data, how we think about it, what we do with it. And so I'll just give one example, the employee engagement data, which is a small subset of data that the state of Michigan as an employer collects to measure things like how long someone will stay in state government, if they feel content, if they are champion. It's like a whole thing. I'm sure many of you experience. Say captives. Yeah, we have captives in state government. Scary. Champions. Oh my gosh, you guys. But it's fascinating to me how that data is interpreted. And I will share with you just one of my initial sort of shocking findings is how that data is manipulated to tell a story of look at how awesome we are. Everyone loves state government. Gosh. And I'm so we looked at that data. It said that. It really did. That was the story that was being told across every department. And then we started to disaggregate that and we were like, maybe it's not such a great place to work for some people. What does that mean? And so, but that got to how that data was being interpreted, how it was being collected, how it was being preserved, how it was the longitudinal, exactly what you're saying. So we as equity officers have been thinking about how we want to drive continuity across the systems. So I don't know what that will look like for the broader, the bigger context of the statewide data, but I will tell you that we pull Scott's data and compare it to that employee engagement data. So we look at that workforce development data, we look at so I don't know if that gives you any hope, but we're trying to think about the complexity of the systems, because even as you were saying that, and I said the thing I said about Scott earlier about I get nervous when people like him are in the room because he's going to ask hard questions and I don't know all the questions to ask. I think part of it is just being in the space together and sort of being willing to be brave around exploring. So I don't know if that helps. Okay.
Right. Tori and then George.
So as a formerly incarcerated person, now working with Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, when you talk about the disparities of impact, when you go into MDOC, you either check white or non-white. So how do we even begin to see the disparities of impact when there's only two choices in that? And then the other piece is, Brene Brown talks about minding the gap and what are stated values versus what are you actually doing. So when you talk about inclusion and equity, I hear it and it sounds great, but there's a group of people, there's a lot of people that we work with on the ground that do not see equity and inclusion. And that's, formerly incarcerated. And I'll even take it a step further, the families of those that are incarcerated. So, how do we begin to, change the narrative, number one, in incarceration, right? Being able to see all the folks that are impacted, and then on the ground when they come home.
Yeah, I think you're talking to me because I'm with the state. I'm here for it. I'm 100% here for the conversation. I want you to know that. I think that what you're pointing at is what I was talking about earlier on, which is that the systems level change is slow. It doesn't feel warm and fuzzy. You can't always see it from outside the system. So I want to say that really clearly because that's the most honest answer I can give you about the work that we're doing. I do think that the structure that we set up specifically around the departmental sort of we have the statewide framework for equity and inclusion, which, it just feels like it just moves what's that word, glacially? Glaciers. That's how it feels some days. I'm like, oh, it can't be that hard. It can't, but it is, because it's like I said, ginormous. But then you have the systems at the departmental level. So what I would say is that your questions are very specifically related to Department of Corrections. So I would be really interested in pulling you into a conversation with the equity officer from Department of Corrections. Not the top, not Heidi, who's the top, right? But the equity officer, because that's where the synergy can happen around you can have open dialogue. We can learn what some of your ideas are and we could move from that space. And then we take that back to the director. I don't want to call her a director because she's the warden, right? Is she the director? Is she the director? Okay. I can't ever get the titles right in state government. You can. I'm not mad at you. I get it. But so that's where so I'm not saying you're wrong about the rigidity that's happening there. That's a long culture, a history, which we could get into a whole lot of conversations about. We're not going to, though, because there's a camera going right now. But there are opportunities from within that system that could address what you're talking about. So I hear you. The progress is not quick enough. It's not sweeping enough. And we're doing the best that we can with what we've got. And we're deeply committed. So it just doesn't, as I'm saying it, I'm like, it ain't enough. But it's what I can offer honestly.
Well, I'll be happy to.
Let's get it. Let's get lunch. Let's talk. Yes. Okay.
Tori, if I may encourage you, you may be more heartened than you think to speak with other people at your table. Okay, excellent. To learn of some internal changes at the MDOC. So
in the last few years, started collecting, including not just white and not white, but historically that has been a huge thing. We didn't even have a Hispanic Latino.
I will tell you too,
historically, but in the last few years, MDOC has put forth an effort to clean up a lot of their racial data and have better inclusion than just white, not white, but historically it's had a very big problem.
I will tell you that when we were filling those roles for equity officers, the person who applied for the equity officer at Department of Corrections was coming from the Department of Education. She was an internal state government candidate. And I did not support her selection. She knows this, so I'm not sharing. Because I was like, she's not gonna get it. She's coming from the land of fairy tales going into Department of Corrections. I don't think I feel like you gotta get someone that knows the culture. And it turned out that because she had all this experience in state government, because she was kind of relentlessly optimistic, and because she met folks within the Department of Corrections that wanted to see change, there was a synergy there. So I do feel like the work that is happening at Department of Corrections has a tremendous amount of potential, and is really in progress. But yeah, so I just wanted to give you that little beat of hope that it might not look like there's anything happening, but I believe that they're doing some good work over there. So.
And another beat of hope, and I know we're out of time, so this will be my final comment, is right now what's happening at the state level is the push for a racial classification code, which RCC, which is basically the bill that's just getting started. It's just circulating now in the state House, is to take this new federal standard and make it the racial classification code for the state of Michigan. So instead of having to go agency to agency and beg people to implement this thing,
what I do.
It would be a single piece of legislation that would say, this is now how we collect it across the state. So keep an eye out for that.
That's the big,
as it circulates.
right?
That's the big, but then we still are gonna need to push people to implement it. Maybe it'll say just collect white, black, Latino, MENA, but we want them to go further and have the detailed data. So there's lots of pushing that's gonna have to happen, but there is hope that a lot of these systemic issues might get addressed soon.
I'm okay if you want to forego and keep things moving, because your timeline's blown out.
It is. We're not going to have this many people all up front ready to talk to you for a moment. So I'm going to let you have the last question, if that's okay. And
Okay, and it was just simply a framing
yeah.
thing. I'm a data scientist and a researcher as well. And so I'm thrilled. I said to Robin, this paper was enough for me to drive 5 hours from Charlevoix, Michigan to see this today. So thank you. I'm really glad that that's there. I wanted to go back and reemphasize Scott's presentation about, he talked about ways in which we use data. And I think I find when I'm in rooms like this with non-research data people, we get into more of the marketing side, the presentation and reporting side versus the evaluative strategic thinking, the story, there's all those pieces along the way. And what I heard in your comment earlier was a lot of, we need to be intentional about how we're using and marketing our data and not let everything just get washed over into boxes. But then there's also, and then I felt guilty because I'm always aggregating to this larger scale when I'm doing exploratory data analysis, right? But that would never go out in a report. And so I just wanted to kind of emphasize, I think Scott did a good job of putting bullet points up about the different faces, it's lenses, like we're talking copied lenses. Data has a lot of lenses too, it's not just a single thing. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about kind of ways you too can step up and help in this advocacy. Thank you so much. Take a minute.
Great talking to you. I'm sure we'll be crossing paths a lot. Yeah. Great work.
For this next part, the second part of our session today, what we're going to do is really focus on what we're hoping to see at the state level and boil it down to just a very simple ask, right? So Matthew talked about the new format put out by the federal government on how to ask for race and ethnicity information. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then if we could take just a few minutes at the end to break out into individual groups to talk about how they might look at your organization, like what can you do, right, to promote these changes. So this second portion really is about our ask, I guess, of you and how you can help. So without further ado, I'll get into a little bit of that. Changing all my script and slides on the fly, which please bear with me. It might be some difficulty, but again, only the best panels steal everything you're about to say and do it better than you could. For the first part, I'd like to take a step back and walk us through a few assumptions that I've made so far, right? And a few assumptions that we've made about kind of where everybody's at as far as their understanding, their knowledge of what is happening at the levels of the federal government, right? As far as data is concerned, right? We talk about data disaggregation, right? Data is a pretty wonky topic as it is, at least a few steps away from the people who compose the numbers themselves, right? And then we add these terms like disaggregation, right? Like race and ethnicity data collection, right? We make things more confusing. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to just model, I guess, for you here how we try to talk about the topic in the hopes that you'll maybe find something of use here as you go out and talk to other people about it, right? Like what we're asking. And honestly, besides, who doesn't need a refresher every now and then, right? On how we talk about data. So you've already heard us, well, Matthew really mentioned the big news, right? In a rather surprising announcement, surprising for its speed, right? In a surprising announcement, the federal government said it was going to, brace yourself, right? Collect more of your personal data, right? At the root, that's really what's happening here. And why are people excited about this? What is really happening? What does this really mean? A couple of news clips here that tell us exactly what it means, right? The Wall Street Journal tells us changes will eventually require thousands of state and local governments and businesses to make changes to their forms and data systems. Okay, great, right? Like, that's exciting. New York, it's going to create more jobs for a couple of people, right, at the federal level. New York Times says something a little bit more colorful, right? The changes would produce by far the most detailed portrait of the nation's ancestral palette ever compiled, right? So what exactly has changed here? What exactly has changed? In order to answer that question, let's think about how we normally react to similar news. I'm going to borrow a snippet from a blog we published last year on this topic and say, in today's data-drenched culture, we are accustomed to thinking of governments, as well as global corporations, Silicon Valley startups, every company that promotes its latest free phone app, right, as vacuuming up too much of our personal information. Right? We're accustomed to thinking of information getting sucked up by all these companies that don't use it responsibly. But we don't often think of the opposite problem, right? Sometimes the state chooses not to see certain information, and this too can be harmful. On missingnumbers.org, right, the journalist Anna Powell Smith writes about political power. After doing a lot of work in the public policy realm, she writes, quote, "I started to notice a pattern across lots of different policy areas. It was impossible for governments to make good decisions because of a basic lack of data. There was always critical data that the state either didn't collect at all or collected so badly that it made change impossible." Right? The power to not collect data is one of the most important and little understood sources of power that governments have. One of those key pieces of information that the state doesn't always collect, or frankly collect badly, is an individual's race and ethnicity. When we're presented with another report on housing, blood lead levels, incarceration, one of the most important follow-up questions is, but how does this look for people who identify as Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Middle Eastern or North African, white, right? When we ask those follow-up questions, we're talking about data disaggregation. The way I like to think of it is this. When we disaggregate data, we're inserting humanity into numbers. We humans are complex creatures, right? There is no single number that fully encapsulates you at this very moment. Think about this. If I told you that as of March 2024, the employed, quote, civilian non-institutional labor force of the United States was about 161 million people, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that we're counting humans, for one. It tells you that we're counting people who do some activity and get compensation for that activity, whether they're compensated in money or in kind, such as paid in food or shelter. I did look up the definition that is what it tells us. If we define civilian non-institutional labor force, we learn further that we're talking about people who are age 16 or older and who aren't in prison, mental institutions, nursing homes, or the military. Right? So that's what that number tells us. Now, what if I told you that about 3,000 of those folks were employed at Grand Valley State University? Okay, now we've added a layer of complexity. To the above definition, we've now added a specific employer. And that tells us a little bit more about those people than the much bigger number. We know that they pay taxes in Michigan now, right? They show up in that data set. We know they work for a nonprofit, and a big state-funded one at that. Now, what if I told you that the number of people working at GVSU who are legally married, have 2 children who identify as white, non-Hispanic, Latina, and whose house is occupied by a dog, guinea pig, and rabbit, is 1? Well, that's me, right? That's me. With every added data point, we get a little closer to individuality, to the complexity, messiness, and wonder of humanity. The more we disaggregate numbers of people, the more we know about the identities and the lives and the humanity of those people. If I'm being honest, I don't love the term disaggregation. It's long. It's a little incomprehensible. It defines something by its negative, right? We were hoping to disaggregate some numbers. Instead, we're really hoping to add humanity. That's what we're after here. I'm going to very briefly talk about some of the changes at the national level, the federal level, a little bit of history on what Matthew told us about just a little bit ago, right, when he talked about the federal government's recent decision in this field. Let's talk about kind of what built up to that, like why we're seeing that, in the hopes that that informs, I think, how we think of things moving forward. In 1977, in response to the civil rights movements, a slow response admittedly, but in response to the civil rights movements of Black and African American and Chicano activists, the Federal Office of Management and Budget adopted Statistical Policy Directive number 15, right, which, quote, provides standard classifications for record keeping, collection, and presentation of data on race and ethnicity and federal program administrative reporting and statistical activities, end quote. Super dry, right? This was a big change. Why? Well, the Office of Management and Budget directs the entire federal government statistical data collection, as Matthew said, right? Including that of the U.S. Census Bureau. And being counted in the census means being counted for election districts, social programs, et cetera, right? In other words, the census both determines how much we get from the federal government and how we can vote for who gets to decide what we get, right? Among other personal details, the census asks about your racial and ethnic identity. Now, 1977 was not the first time that it asked this question, right? Or, frankly, how they instructed census takers to ask this question or to identify people by sight, right? The race question is, in fact, one of the oldest questions on the U.S. Census. It's been asked in some form every time since the questionnaire was first established in 1790. However, just as it has appeared on every U.S. Census in the past 230 years, it has varied at least slightly in every survey. Every time it comes around, they change it just a little bit. The innovation of this directive was to qualify how race data was used. Now, from 1977 onward, the data would be used not simply to surveil a population, right? Although it would certainly still be used for that, we know. Not simply to surveil, but also to enforce civil rights. In other words, after 1977, at least as far as this policy directive was concerned, those groups who were counted now counted, right, for the federal government. Okay. These are the 3 reasons specified in that directive for establishing these reporting standards. Right at the top of the list, again, according to the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, quote, the categories specified above will be used by all agencies for civil rights compliance reporting and equal employment reporting for both the public and private sectors and for all levels of government. What are those categories specified above? So in 1977, they look like this. In 1997, the OMB revised Directive 15 slightly and has left it largely untouched ever since, until like last month, right? But I'm guessing most of us are familiar with the above format. You may also have heard that race and ethnicity are social constructs, right? It's somewhat controversial, I know, to claim. Like there is some debate about this, but I'm just going to tell you it's true, right? The way we identify ourselves and the way others identify us has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the time and the place we find ourselves. And as you might expect from a social construct, the way we identify changes over time, right? A lot has changed in the last quarter century since this format was established. And popular racial and ethnic categories have long reflected the disconnect between those federal standards and common understanding. For example, if you don't identify this way yourself, you've certainly heard others identify themselves as brown, right? We say black and brown folks, right? There is no brown category here, right? You first pick whether or not you identify as Hispanic or Latino, and then you must pick whether you identify as white, black, right? Asian or Pacific Islander. Disconnect, right? Disconnect. More and more people are rejecting the way the government has asked these questions. According to the OMB, this was something they put out recently when they talked about the changes that they were about to make. Evidence suggests that the use of separate race and ethnicity questions confuses many respondents, right, who instead understand race and ethnicity to be similar or the same concepts. And they talk about here, as you can see, they pinpoint Hispanic or Latino respondents. Now, saying people who identify as Hispanic or Latino are confused about the questions is a dubious claim. Nevertheless, it is clear that the way the government asks or asked about existing categories just did not accurately reflect how people identified themselves in the 2000 and 2010 censuses. So again, keep in mind the previous format was adopted in 97. Right away in the 2000 census, some other race, quote, some other race was the 3rd largest racial group in the United States, right? Within 3 years after adopting this change, still the 3rd largest racial group was people not finding themselves in these categories. That just disappeared, I don't know. There we go. In 2020, it rose to 2nd place, right? So 1 of every 7 people in the United States did not see themselves in the racial categories as written. At least up until a month ago, right? So again, I won't spend much time talking about it. Matthew really introduced the topic quite well. You do have in your packets that handout that kind of details some of the changes that are being made and put forward, and then some of the methodology changes, the way that they want to ask this data, right, are changing as well. But to highlight again what Matthew had pointed out, these are the big changes, right? We're going to see a combined race and ethnicity question, this additional category, And Matthew pointed out that federal agencies are really only required to put in the minimum categories. However, the Office of Management and Budget, to their credit, did put more teeth on this middle bullet point. And so the question that's on that handout is actually the default required format, right? This is what every federal agency will be asked and told to put in, right, when they are making those changes to their data collection. There is an exemption process, but again, we're told, we don't know what quite it will look like, but we're told that it's going to have more teeth, right? It's not going to be just a simple, oh, someone at the agency needs to write a letter to get out of it, and then we'll just go back to the minimum categories. It's going to be a longer process of application and submission and evaluation. All right. Yeah, this is tiny, but again, you've got it in your folders in front of you. As we heard from Matthew earlier, right, the hope is, one of these hopes is that it'll offer a better view of a community that paradoxically has been both under the microscope and simultaneously ignored when it comes to election districts and federal assistance, right? As one Arab American activist put it recently, if the government is able to target us and surveil us, why can't we see the data and use it for our own ends, right? Are there any concerns with these changes? Definitely, right? Absolutely. And we would be remiss if we didn't just at least briefly mention these, right? Regina pointed this out, I think, earlier, right? When talked about the concern that folks won't select all that apply, right? So that's here in the second point. There's a fear about an erasure of groups like African Arabs, right? Afro-Latinos. There's a fear that when confronted with all these choices, people are just going to click one and just say, okay, I'm done, right? I don't need to select anything else. I don't need to out myself as Afro-Latino, right? Whereas the two questions, the thought was anyway, some groups have suggested that with two questions it was, okay, well, I need to put something in both categories. Now, with just one box, the concern is people will say, one, I'm good. I don't need to do anything else. And then again, even though the majority of public input on this top subject here expressed support for adding this category to identify, and I'm quoting here from the Office of Management and Budget, to identify descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, there was support for terms including foundational Black American, American descendant of slavery, American freedman, Black American, African American, Negro, or American Negro. However, there was disagreement about which term is preferred. Commenters described the importance of collecting these data and the value for data users and policymakers, pointing to existing research that shows differences in outcome measures like income and wealth, and stated that descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States are ethnically distinct from African immigrants, end quote. But importantly, not all civil rights groups supported this question, right? Back to quoting the OMB, commenters expressed concern about the difficulty of verifying that identification is accurate, the usefulness or necessity of the data, the exclusion of other groups of historically enslaved peoples, and the creation of confusion that could make the Black or African American community harder to count, end quote. This is what the federal government is most concerned about, right, is confusion, right? They want to eliminate that some other race category, and they want people to find themselves in the data. So they declined these changes for now. They declined the first change for now and went with the single question, kind of overriding the concerns of some advocacy groups. Very quickly, I'm just going to wrap up. Why do these changes at the federal level matter to us here in Michigan? Well, on one level, the problem is that these changes don't, in fact, matter here in Michigan, right? At least not immediately and directly. The Office of Management and Budget, again, as Matthew pointed out, only directs federal agencies. Our legislature doesn't have to dedicate resources to assist state agencies with change. Doesn't have to do that, right? State agencies can continue to follow historical paths, right? As long as they don't have to report data up to the federal government, things can just continue as they have gone for a while. And this, of course, means that the MENA category, for one, won't necessarily be added. Matthew talked about legislation to get there, and I think that bears some following and some support. Because again, one of the concerns is that it frankly doesn't matter necessarily. All right, now my notes are all upside down. I think I'm going to cut us off here. And what I'd like to do is shift us over to invite my other colleagues up. Let's talk very quickly about some resources that we have for you. So one moment while I collect my slides. All right, we're just going to wing it. So we've got some campaign resources that we're offering here. In your folders there, you'll see a few. The handout that describes the changes that the federal government has put in place can help in your conversations as you explain to others the changes we'd like to see at the state level. Right? We ultimately would like to see all state agencies make these changes, right? Adopt this format when collecting race or ethnicity data. Now we know that not all agencies directly collect race and ethnicity data. They don't need to necessarily. But we, at the very least, like all state agencies to have access to data collected in this way, right? So this handout may help explain those changes, right? As you talk with state folks. Mm-hmm. This bit.ly here is for our website, our landing page for the campaign. We have a number of resources there, including a partner organizing toolkit, right? So there's a really very impressive toolkit linked there on that site that was put together by our national funder. So a group called the Leadership Conference Education Fund. And in that toolkit there they distilled everything quite beautifully, quite lovely, right? So key messages to use, sample letters for engaging legislators, other state folks, national level mini case studies, right? So just little snippets, little ways to talk about what these changes in federal race and ethnicity data collection can mean for communities. There's a national landscape scan, which brings you, I think it's only up till the end of 2023, unfortunately. So there has been some movement in 2024, but it at least brings you up to fall 2023, the end of 2023, as far as what states have done to enact broader change, right? Illinois being the first in the country to add a MENA category across all state agencies in their data collection. That report is there on the page. We've already talked about this. And then there's also a draft of a case study we put together, right, to discuss the Michigan's Coronavirus Racial Disparities Task Force. This is in draft form because, first of all, we're going to design it, right? We've got all these fancy other graphics, right? And so we're going to run it through our designer. But before we do that, I'd like your input on it, right? Like, does it say what you think is most effective, right? Like, how best can we put out the case to demonstrate the power that disaggregated race and ethnicity information had to target efforts during the pandemic, right? So for those of you who may not be up on it, right, the Racial Disparities Task Force was formed when early data on COVID-19 mortality, right, on deaths and cases showed just a horrific disparity, right? The rather shocking number is early, within the first couple of weeks after COVID-19 was first detected in the state, 14% of people who identify as Black or African American, there are, of the population of Michigan, 14% identify as Black or African American, 41% were dying right, of the disease, right? Massive disparity. The Racial Disparities Task Force was put together to address those disparities. And this case study walks through how that happened, how it worked out, and I'd like your thoughts there. So after the event, right? But still, that's there for use, right? Finally, we've got a couple of other things coming for you. Another case study will come your way. This one we're working with the Department of Corrections on, right, to talk about some of their internal changes. And that also we hope will be used to talk through other state agency changes, right? Social media posts and videos will be coming through to you. And it is, in fact, that I'd like to turn next. If Emily, you would mind coming up and talking us through the different tiers of commitment. So for this, you'll see in your folders, you've got, I think it's a stapled 2 pages, right? And it talks about different ways you can commit here today to continuing to engage in the campaign. There is money attached, right? This is where we get super cheesy, but it is money involved to actively promote and push out this information. So without further ado.
Hi, everyone. My name's Emily Doebler. I'm a research associate at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. I hope you can see me. I'm probably barely reaching the top of this. So I'm happy that we could all gather here today to talk in person. I know we've had a lot of email communication. I just feel really good about the discourse that we've been having today and sharing with each other. So thanks for all coming. The last portion of our time, I'm going to kind of run through it a little bit quickly because I think the most important work is yet to come. So the last portion will be a breakout group format, which we've already talked about, but I wanted to quickly go over this tier sheet. As we've heard today, this effort relies on collective action and knowledge sharing. So to kind of support that, the Johnson Center has come up with this tiered system of engagement that you could sign up to be a partner on. So the first tier is, there are 3 tiers of engagement, and each of those tiers build off of the previous. So the first tier would require your organization share at least 3 social media posts or newsletter mentions. And as Aaron just said, we're going to be coming up with some content that we can give you instead of kind of putting that burden on you all. So for that tier, we'd be providing a $3,000 stipend. The second tier would require the fulfillment of tier 1 along with, the second tier would require the fulfillment of tier 1 along with sending letters of support to state agencies or legislators. For that tier, we would provide a $6,000 stipend. And then for the third tier, that tier requires the fulfillment of tier 2, along with asking other organizations in your network to also share social media posts or write letters. And so, as I just mentioned, to support this advocacy work that I just mentioned, we are going to be providing a digital toolkit. And honestly, our hope is that by providing and supporting this opportunity, we can have a wider reach, right? Like the Johnson Center can't reach everyone. So we're kind of relying on and hoping that we can all get together and push for this work to succeed. So I just went over that really fast. If you have any questions, feel free to email Aaron or I believe our emails are on the second page of this tier sheet. And to move into the breakout sessions, we have a diverse group of people here. So we have state folks, we have nonprofit folks, we have foundation folks. So we're gonna split the room and kind of cater some questions to each group. So for the philanthropic nonprofit folks, we'd like to ask 3 questions for you to consider. The first is, where can your organization partner in this project? The second is, what is one step you know you can take effectively? And the third is, where will you need more peer insight? Where do you see yourself needing support from people around you? For representatives from state agencies, We'd like you to discuss how constituents can reach your department effectively. We'd also like you to talk about what you see as major barriers departments face when making or even thinking about making a change like this. And are there any other advocacy methods that you would recommend that we haven't yet talked about here today? So I'll leave these questions up. Are they on there? There we go. So we'll break out into our groups for about 10 minutes. I don't know, we can have state agencies kind of conglomerate together, maybe in this side of the room. I think we're all over here. And then maybe 2 groups of everyone left. So we'll split up into 3 groups. And Aaron and I and Mandy will all be kind of walking around and help talk through the questions. So yeah, with that, please go forth and talk.
Where should we start? Are you all ready to do the biggest group? So that must mean you had the most to put. So let's see what you had to say.
Okay. You guys help me. Yeah. So we're this state agency group over here, and I think we spent the first part kind of getting to know each other, like who's represented. And I had a little sidebar with Aaron, like when we talk about effective data disaggregation by state agencies, like who are the agencies we're talking about, right? So we had some dialogue about agencies can be collectors and they can be consumers. So I think we've landed on it about at least between Department of Education, Corrections, LEO, DNR, that we're a little bit of both. So that helped to kind of guide some of our continued conversation. When it came to, we danced around a little bit. I think we maybe talked about some of the barriers first and foremost. And we had some recent examples of, can we even collect this, right? Like that kind of general question, is this public, is this personal information? Can we even ask these questions, right? So they kind of that unknown. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, because that's with our marketing and outreach team, like, surveys, of our system users, our licensed buyers, like there's different sets of people we can ask, but
we can collect it, but how do we use it once we have it?
Yeah.
Because if it's personal, we can use it internally, but if other people externally ask for it, they can't have it. Even if it's a marketing firm, we can't share it with them. If we can, but we'll get in a lot of trouble if we do. It's the same with somebody visiting a program at our parks. We can ask for their information, they don't have to share it with us. So it's basically a voluntary process, or if we have a education for children, you don't really want to ask that information all the time. So it's, we get the data, but it's, how do we use that data once we get it, if we get it at all? Parks or trail users, a lot of times, and parks users, we don't have that information. We can't get any information from Secretary of State either. If there's anybody in here from Secretary of State, they won't share anything with us. So if you can do anything about that, yeah.
A couple other things on the barrier side, right, is how we ask.
Yeah.
Right? So we're working on our limited English proficiency. Like we've asked a certain language way for a really long time, so how do we diversify that? And then our fallback as well, we'll put it on an electronic survey, right? So there's an implied barrier there that everybody's can either go to our website or have the technology to respond to that survey. So different ways of asking, actually getting into the communities, like that's another barrier. I think we talked about too, like at the agency level, I was channeling my inner Poppy about this, right? Like, so sometimes it takes that executive directive order to get agencies to fall in line, and then you still have your director, and then you still got those layers down to that programmatic level where you're really trying to get that maybe information collected, and that's a lot of trickle down. It takes a lot, I think, and then as it goes back up, there's recognition of like, geez, did our legal office review this? Can we do this? Are we supposed to do this by statute or policy? So just that red tape, that bureaucracy getting in the way is a barrier.
Yep, absolutely. And we come from an agency where at the DNR, I'll speak on behalf of everybody else in our group, that we've done something this way for a very long time. So change is very uncomfortable for people, but it's changing. We have a lot of different people moving up in the ranks, and that's very, very good. So we ask a lot of questions and we challenge things.
We'll go backwards now. So how can they reach out? I think we recognize that each agency has some external body, board, commission, council, group that's appointed by the director, appointed by the governor, that is there to help advise and guide. So there's public meeting opportunities where people can go to forums, have their voices be heard. There's, do we have other ones for how constituents reach out? I think it's back to our engagement with them, how we reach out to them in some ways is maybe most important.
And if we can let them know how they can benefit from our services, then they'll see why it's important that we're collecting their information. I think transparency is really important. We're collecting this not because we're Big Brother and we're the government. We're collecting this information so you can see how we can help you.
So we'll bounce to advocacy ideas. There's recognition, Scott's not here either, but there's this network of data stewards. Brian's one for us. They come together every other month. So you already have a forum where the data people are getting together. So the opportunity to influence those agencies, whether they're consumers or collectors, like there's a forum to have that conversation. And, I was thinking too about the data standards. So back to check all that apply, but then what's the standard to ensure that that is recognized throughout all those other agencies using it in different ways. So that'd probably be the think tank to chew on some of that. I think we also identified there's stakeholder groups around every agency at the end of the day. Again, people that recognize either with what this agency should be doing or I want to support this agency. So there's other outside entities that become a forum, a venue for voices to be heard. And then just the concept of open data. So making it more readily available. So it's not just the agencies using it and consuming it, but get it out there for others to use as well. So as far as I look at the rest of the group to back clean up, if there's any other important points there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep, all right.
In between, which is fun. But so we started with the conversation about demographics that grantees are often providing about the makeup of their boards and staff. But we had a conversation about expanding that to include population served. So this new kind of form, but thinking also about population served. And a lot of foundations are thinking about how to simplify application processes and things. So maybe kind of the education component as we're having those conversations, a way to sort of convene to talk about how do we collect this data effectively. That talked about use also. So the kind of open data piece was also something we talked about, and accessibility. Though there is a caveat, we recognize, right, we've talked a lot about narrative, right? So you want it to be open and available, but we recognize that we're all not data scientists, and we want to be sure that there's context and understanding and science that's kind of guiding the narratives that are ultimately coming out of the kind of analysis of that data. Yes, talked about the education, of the kind of how and why specifically for philanthropy. Another piece that's also kind of a question to folks, and I know we're really kind of at time, so maybe not today, but the suppression of data was something that we discussed, concerns about when numbers get too low, then you're not able to report anything out. So you might have these kind of glaring gaps in certain counties, particularly in Michigan, where population levels are just very, very low. So if you spread everyone out into these very specific categories, right? Like we're adding more humanity back in, but are we then making kind of these black holes, a lack of understanding about certain populations because numbers get too low, which we know certainly happened for American Indian and Alaska Native populations even before, say, like the addition of the MENA category. Did I miss something? We talked about, hopefully I covered it.
Yeah,
Okay.
you did a good job.
Yes,
I was going quick. I know folks are at time. I'm listening. Anyway, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I missed the first bullet point for authentic community voices. I was in the bathroom. Didn't want to.
I think it was just bringing community voices to
to the data and why data disaggregation is important. Okay, I just didn't want to glaze over it. So the first question, where can your organization partner in this project? We had obviously the authentic community voices and some advocacy with legislators, and the possibility of using some of our platforms to share it on social media and connect with others. We had some ideas of connecting with like each of our groups together and how we're going to display data, possibly just collaboration within all of our organizations. And then we did have some questions for probably the peer insight question, I would say it would relate to, about how long it's going to take agencies to implement these changes. I don't know. Yeah, we just had some questions on how long that's going to take if it's not enforced, obviously, at the state level, and even if it is. Data literacy, kind of what Amber just touched on for the push for open data, but also recognizing that we're not all data gurus and data experts. Stephanie had some really great questions and insights on developing visualizations for the new categories and if a lot of data organizations are going to even agree on how to display the data and how we're going to get through kind of the dilemma of not like how are we describing?
Having data tell the wrong story.
Yeah, having data tell the wrong story or having a lot of data fall into that like other or check all that apply box, or having that get glazed over. And then some questions. Stephanie also had some good insight on barriers to software updates and just like the technicalities of how we're going to display this visually. And kind of shifting topic to how we're going to fight for this in the legislature and how we're going to educate and present this data. I'm sorry, you guys. Like how we're going to present this change without trying to politicize it, I guess you could say, to the legislature and making it super politicized, and just explaining how it's going to help all communities and it's going to help rural communities. It's going to really shine light on all different areas of education, health, and safety, and help all communities and not just, not just the added categories too. I don't know what this last one is.
Community informed data collection.
Yeah, communities informing data collection and data equity is the center.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. That probably wasn't the best reason to present it.
Right, I know we're at time. Did you want to, sorry.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Well done.
Excellent. So yes, we will put all these things together and then get them out to you. I just wanted to very, very briefly mention a couple of things that I'm hearing, and that is hearing a lot about data literacy, right, and data accessibility. I think you mentioned something. I was shamelessly eavesdropping, as I said. I just was listening in. But there is a lot of data already out there and already accessible, right? It is in a format that is not easily read or legible by a lot of people, right? That is a technical issue. We can help with that. Right? Dan, you mentioned how we ask about these questions, right? Concerns about Big Brother, you mentioned, right? These are real concerns, right? Revealing, on the one hand, I think we have competing needs. And so I'll just close out by pointing to these competing needs. On the one hand, we don't know certain important details about communities in our state. And I just jotted a couple down. We don't know what percentage of Hispanic or Latino children have high levels of lead in their blood, right? State data on children's elevated blood lead levels isn't disaggregated by race or ethnicity. On the other hand, what we're hearing from folks at the state is a very legitimate concern that you're going to be running up against people who don't want to provide data to the government, right? That's a communication issue. We can help with that. I think we can all work together to help with that, right? As the conversation continues, then I think we can work together to both advocate internally, as you said, right, as data consumers in some of our departments, right, asking for certain changes among other departments. We can advocate externally, right, and point out the needs that our communities have for data. And meanwhile, we can address all these technical things, I think. And there's did you say monthly or every other month? Bi-monthly? Okay, that's perfect. Monthly meetings are terrible. Bi-monthly sounds great. It sounds like there are places to plug in, right? And it sounds like there are very technical issues that I know Philanthropy has worked on the past, right? And I know there's a lot that I don't know, from the philanthropy sector about how the state functions, right? And the barriers that the state runs up against. So please, going forward, let's stay in contact and continue this conversation. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's all I had. I don't want to take any more of your time. So thank you so much.